Welcome to the show, Dark Valiants. I know I don't usually pop out until the end, but I've got something quite special to share this time. The Mortis Maledictum novel is finally available. Yes, that means every story you've heard here and all the ones coming up are out on Amazon to read. So if you want to read along or read ahead, the link is down in the show notes. And since the sole most important thing in getting these defiling gremlins to help us grow our dark family is reviews, we ask that you please consider throwing out a few words to help spread the madness. Thank you.
Mother Nature isn't all that nurturing. She's not the mother who cares for her children, but more like the wretch who birthed the monsters under the bed. And humans? Well, humans are the chattel. She made us to feed to her creatures of instinct and darkness. Mother Nature hates history, you see. She does her utmost to wipe it from existence. The cracks in the pavement, the rot in old houses, and the hatred in men's hearts are all her work. She wanted us left alone in the dark without the knowledge to defend ourselves. East Tennessee wasn't the same as Egypt or Rome or Aleppo either. We didn't have monuments to history here, so we didn't have anything to warn us of her dark and wretched desire to feed us to the other things. No, we didn't know, but it didn't stop the Briar Stag from taking the ones that it wanted. My family taught us girls a little of what they had gleaned about Mother Nature from our time in East Tennessee, but the boys didn't have time to sit and listen. Their bent was to be out exploring, jumping in holes, digging through caves with old worn flashlights, and climbing her trees. My mother loved John Denver, and so when my baby brother was born, that's what she called him, John. I was older than him by almost a dozen years, and when I was born, she called me Samantha. I like Sammy more, and all my friends called me that, but I couldn't ever get Mama to shorten it. Every 4 years, the girls would go out in the woods to a place you couldn't put on a map. I went the first time when I was 6, and again when I was 10. We went out with one mission to do. It was our job, the Holloway girls' job, to put the Briar Stag back in the ground. John was 7 years old now, and like every 7-year-old boy, you couldn't ever keep up with him. So it wasn't a surprise when it started to get dark and he hadn't come home yet. We thought nothing of it until the last dusting of light faded from the tops of the pines, and we heard him scream. I had torn out the front door with my mama, Aunt Carol, and Aunt Lindy right behind me. Dinner was still bubbling on the stove, instantly forgotten as we sprinted across the field in the direction of Little John's screams. The screen door slapped hard against the wooden frame of the front door, and then the only sounds other than our labored breathing were the crickets singing to each other in the tall grass. We pulled up short of the wood line. I tried to slow down enough to get some clue where John was, but there wasn't anything. Not even a snapped branch or a bent blade of grass to mark where he had gone. Mama looked at the three of us and then seemed to make her mind up about something. "Samantha, go with Aunt Carol. It's near time. Make sure the stag is still in the ground." "But Mama, we need to find..." "Now don't but Mama me. Aunt Lindy and I'll find John. You just do this for me, okay?" I couldn't tell if she was worried the Briar Stag was after little John or about my safety looking for him on my own. There were still 60 days or more until the ritual was due. The wards could hold till then. This couldn't be its hand at work, could it? This wasn't the time to argue. Little John's scream had been one of fatal terror, and my being almost grown or not, I still didn't push the subject further. Instead, Aunt Carol and I ran off into the woods, past the property line, and into the wild places of brown brambles and black sap, looking for an unmarked grave we hoped was still covered in the hard stones and blessed dirt we had put atop it. "Come on, Sammy," Aunt Carol said, putting a hand on my shoulder. She was worried just as much as I was. I could hear the tremor in her voice, but she was just as stubborn as my mama. If they were of the same mind, well, there wouldn't be any change in it. Mama and Aunt Lindy had already started away into the gloom of the dark trees. They had spread out to cover more ground. With nothing else I could do, I went with Aunt Carol. We returned to the house, if only for a moment. I turned the stove off, and Carol opened up an old strongbox bound with thick rusted metal banding. I didn't see what she grabbed out of it, but I could guess. The box contained our instruments of ritual. I didn't know who back in my family tree had discovered the right sequence of flames, words, and wood, but using them was simple enough. There were 3 rods, each the length of my forearm, and words covered the ashen surface, carved into their flesh, and heavy-handed tools. Mama told me Grandmama's grandmama had traded with a spirit of shade and wilderness for the knowledge of how to use them, but we didn't know who had actually made the things. Carol returned after retrieving the rods, a set of red wax candles in a burlap sack, and a flint striker. She handed me the bag of candles and the striker. I nodded my understanding. We didn't know what was out there, but if the Briar Stag had found a way out of its prison early, we needed to be ready. This time, when I left the house, we followed the path to the edge of our property. Then, turning away from the road, we stepped off the edge of civilization and into the wilds. After only a dozen paces, there was no trace of the path back. It was easy to lose yourself in the woods next to the Holloway farm, and I'd succumbed to that threat more than once. This time, I didn't have someone to come find me if I lost myself. Aunt Carol was here with me, and the other 2 were looking for little John. 100 yards felt like 5 miles through the tangle of russet vines and clinging thorns. Everything in those dark woods snapped and pulled at my dress and the burlap sack over my shoulder. Carol was up ahead of me, and she held a hand up back in my direction. I stopped moving, and she took that hand back and put it to her lips for silence. I heard the trickle of softly running water and knew the creek was close by. Running water wouldn't stop the beasts in the wild here, but it would give the spirits pause. It also meant we were on the right track. Carol nodded at me to follow her off to our right. We found the creek after another minute or 2 of fighting through the brush. It was lower than normal. Just a trickle made its way over the smooth rocks. I could step onto an exposed stone in the center, and then one more to the far side, and that's just what we did. On the other bank, Carol reached down and pulled a small mason jar out of a small pocket in her skirt and filled it with muddy creek water. I knew what she was doing, but it wouldn't be enough to put the stag back in the earth. We would need more, much more. The creek was both the first and the last landmark we'd get on our way to the gravesite. It was hard to find for a reason. The last thing these woods needed was an unwitting sacrifice, making its way deep into the heart of the stag's territory. Minutes passed, and Carol and I kept pushing through the brambles. The colors washed out from the bright leafy greens into the dead brown and sharp yellows and reds of the autumn. In this part of the woods, the season was always sitting on the edge of a knife between the bone-deep cold of winter and the hot, sticky of summer. Our ritual was one of timing, and we performed it on the day where the Briar Stag had stopped the slow march of time in its domain. It liked autumn, and when the day matched, the Holloway girls came in and performed the ritual. I felt a chill in the air and knew we were close. It had defenses, things to keep people lost and wandering aimlessly through its woods. Slowly they would find themselves closer and closer to the center of the maze of brambles and thorns. Their sense of direction would tell them they were almost out of the woods, and it couldn't be further from the truth. I looked for that feeling, that dread anxiety intermingling with the hope of seeing the sky again. I knew that it got worse. I knew that the worse it got, the closer I was. A laugh floated across the still air. It came from nowhere and everywhere at once, and it was unmistakably Little John's voice. A sob followed it. The voice choked back tears and then growled. Whatever was out there, it knew we were looking for the Briar Stag, and it knew about Little John. Carol froze at the first sound and pulled out one of the wooden rods. The black ink painted into the carved letters seemed to shine in the dim light of the dense woods. She took it and pushed the tip of the rod into the soft ground. The half-rotted flecks of long dead trees seemed to float on the heavy air like motes of dust. Her eyes rolled back into her head, and her hair fell about as she convulsed once, and then fell still, waiting. The voice returned, this time with murmurs. I couldn't make out the words, but my pulse quickened as I felt a warm breath brush across the back of my neck, and a growl whispered next to my ear. I spun, but there was nothing there except small leaves twisting their way to the ground in the permanent twilight of the Briar Stag's domain. Mama always told me the Appalachian Mountains were the Liars' Mountains. The Rockies were young and sharp, but the mountains here were old, and a viciousness ran through them, infecting the guardians. The woods in this part of the world was run by a spirit we called the Queen. And this queen, well, she is as vicious as they come. The Briar Stag is the queen's pet, and we didn't dare do more to tame her woods and risk her anger. If the stag really was out of its grave before All Hallows Eve, then it could only be the queen's work. As if the forest finally gave up its secrets, Carol opened up her eyes again and stood up. She pointed the rod into the thickest patch of thorns around us. The murmurs stopped, and the air blew cold in our faces. The thorns shriveled and parted, revealing a clearing lit in a soft twilight. There was a stone table on the far side of the clearing, and small bowls made from the same stone in a circle around the Briar Stag's grave, a grave that was open. "Unholy night," Carol said. Her voice came out choked and hollow. I stepped up closer to see inside. I expected to see the stag's thorned body or an empty hole in the ground. Instead, I saw something much worse. Little John laid there in the grave, his eyes open and terrified. Poisoned and black-tipped thorns pricked his wrists as their vines bound him. His ankles were equally restrained, and blood stained his pants where the thorns had sunk deep. A cloth covered his mouth. It might have once been white, but now the dirt of the unholy grave had stained it a dark brown. I wanted to jump down and pull little John free right then and there. Carol put a hand up to stop me as I took one faltering step forward. The wind blew cold in our faces again, and this time another opening on the far side of the clearing. There, I saw Aunt Lindy and Mama. They looked battered, and each leaned on the other for support. Blood and dirt mixed in streaks on their faces, and I could tell they had already met the stag tonight. "Samantha," Mama said. Her voice rasped as she tried to hide the pain that creased her face. There was blood on her right leg, too. It ran like a small river towards the dark earth. "Samantha, the candles. Start the ritual." "But little John," I said as a tear ran down my cheek. "He's trapped." She nodded. "The Queen is about. We have to free him before she gets here." Mama and Aunt Lindy were close now, and Carol reached out a hand to help them to the ground. She lifted Mama's skirt and found a deep gash on the outside of her thigh. She dropped the rod onto the duff of the ground. Mama grimaced when Carol poked her wound with strong fingers, trying to put some pressure on the red tear. Carol looked at Lindy, keeping her thumbs pressed hard to Mama's cut. "She's already been here. The stag didn't free itself, even if it could have taken John." Lindy took the rod Carol had abandoned on the ground next to her and closed her eyes. "Queen is close, and the stag is with her. Samantha, the candles." Mama pressed. "We have to break the connection, and the thorns will wither. We can get him out, but we're gonna have to hurry." I moved quickly then, ensuring I didn't step into the circle of stone bowls. At the midpoint of each, I lit a red candle with the striker from the bag. I put the base of each candle to the ground and piled dirt around them to keep them upright. When I finally placed the last candle in its place, bowls filled with water. It was muddy like the creek, and as I looked down on the closest one, I saw small bubbles teasing across the surface. The candles summoned the water infused with the blessed earth. Lindy helped me tip the bowls over, making tiny rivers through the dead leaves and the rotted bark on the forest floor. The water flowed out of the bowls and made swirls and intricate patterns, as though traced with an artist's hand. All at once, each one of the rivers converged on the top of the grave containing my baby brother. The muddy water dripped down into that grave, and with a hiss, the thorn shriveled up and broke apart. I jumped down into the hole and pulled the dark, stained cloth from Little John's face. He let out a whimper, but otherwise was way too scared to speak. It was a good thing. At that moment, the candles went out, and the sharp smell of black smoke tinged the air.
The land takes what the queen desires,
said the voice that was both inhuman and immortal. It was the voice of the Briar Stag. The grave was deep, and I had to put my feet on a root to pull myself up high enough to see out the top. Mama stood facing the Briar Stag. Bright red rose blossoms flowered on its antlered head, and the limbs traced a deer skeleton. There was a very human heart beating in that monster's breast, and the trinity of its existence was wholly evil. Sitting astride the stag was the most beautiful woman I had ever seen. She glowed with a golden light, and her skin was the tanned color of autumn leaves. Her eyes held steady with a piercing cold blue. She slid her naked body from the back of her pet, and the queen held up a hand to my mother and aunts.
You have kept my tools in hold. Nothing stops nature from moving where it may. Mother does her will, regardless of your walls and roads. She will take them all, and I will take these children for her.
You will do no such thing, Mama said. Her voice was as hard as a rocky cliff. Nothing could erode her will, and I knew the queen would have to kill her to get to me. That thought did not comfort me. I knew the queen could kill her and would think it righteous all the while.
I will take these children and send you back to Earth,
the queen said, and she reached up, seeming to pluck a nut from one of the overhanging trees. She showed it to us. It was dark brown and soon to fall and sprout in the fertile soil. It cracked in her hand, and a small vine climbed out of the pod. In a single second, that vine became a foot long and then 10 feet the next. It lashed out and wrapped Mama's neck. Aunt Lindy and Aunt Carol each plunged their rods into the ground, and I felt a thrum flash through the air. The pressure in that clearing increased. My head flooded with pain, and even through clenched shut eyes I saw red pulsing light. There was the sound of a faraway scream, and then when I finally opened my eyes again, the clearing was empty. The Briar Stag was gone. Mama and my aunts were gone, and the queen was gone. I climbed out of the grave and then helped Little John up, and together we left that cursed place. Where our family went, I didn't know, but I couldn't be the one crying over it. They had disappeared and had taken the queen and the Briar Stag with them. But the Holloway girls had more than one job, and All Hallows Eve was here to shatter the peace in this wooded valley. They left me standing, and I could cry later. I almost heard my mama's voice in my ear whisper across the wind, "Keep John safe." I nodded to the stillness and wiped a tear from my cheek. Then, the two of us, one still growing and one almost grown, headed home.
Well, hello again, my friends. I'm glad you came and listened to our Halloween special. Putting together our main Mortis Maledictum storyline takes time, and we all appreciate your patience. That isn't our only line in the water. Oh no. We hope to put together more of these tiny morsels, the side stories that help flesh out our little dark world. And we hope you will join us as we continue along the path. What will happen to Sammy Holloway and Little John? Where did her mama and aunts go? What else is out there creeping in the dark wilds past the property line? Those are some of the things we want to answer in our next story. Our story today was written by Devin McCamey and performed by our one and only Rosie Knuckles and Gorath Hayoun. Our artwork was, of course, created by Brandon McCamey. If you liked what you heard in this episode, friends, then please do us the favor of letting us know in the dark void that is the comment section and tweet us at Mortis Maledictum. Give us your thoughts on what you think might be coming next. Thank you for listening.